Hey everyone, Mr. Strider here. So today we're going to get into the concept of imaginary numbers. So up until this point, whenever we ended up with a negative inside the square root, we have said it's been no solution. Well, that's going to stop today because we're going to start learning about imaginary numbers and how we can actually have some sort of solution for these equations that don't traditionally have a solution. So before we get started today, we're going to fill out the top of our notes section, the part that says the imaginary numbers. So it starts off by saying equations such as x squared plus 1 equals 0 have no real solution. So mathematicians have decided to use imaginary numbers to represent their solutions. So there's no real solutions to this equation because if I try to move the 1 over, take the square root, I'm going to end up with the square root of -1. So that gets into that next bullet point, the imaginary unit I. So we're going to be working with I, and this is going to be our imaginary unit, and it's defined as I equals the square root of -1. Okay, so this is going to be super useful when we end up with square roots, so the square root symbol of negative numbers. So whenever we have a negative number instead of a square root, we're now going to take out an I because I is the square root of -1. And then the last bullet point says a pure imaginary number is written in the form b I, where b is the real number and I is the imaginary part. So for that last bullet point, your first line is bi, the next underline is b, and the last one is I. So they would read a pure imaginary number is written in the form bi, where b is the real number and I is the imaginary part. So that is where we're going to take the focus of our lesson today. So we're going to work through the next couple problems, 1 through 6, and then we're going to go from there. So I'll see you when we get to that part. All right, so we're back with a couple of examples here. So this should be the numbers 1 and number 2 on your note sheet. So we're going to start off with some perfect squares, and then we'll work into some non-perfect squares. So if we take a look at number 1 here, now we have the square root of -9. So up until this point, we have said that this is no solution because there's no two numbers that are ever going to multiply together to give me a negative number. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this as -1 times +9. And if we do that, that's going to split up the 9 and the -1. Well, what we just talked about in the section above is that the square root of -1 is I, and the square root of 9 is 3. Well, we would traditionally write it with the 3 in front and the I there at the end. And then this is our answer, 3 times I. So I know it's a little weird so far, but we're going to work through a couple more examples and hopefully it'll start to make some sense. So if we take a look at number 2 here, this number is actually also a perfect square, but just like this one, I'm going to rewrite it as -1 times 196. -1 times the positive number I have under the radical. Well, the square root of 1 is I. Well, the square root of 196 is 14. Well, if I rewrite this as one term, I get 14. So again, these are our solutions. It's not as bad as you may think when you hear the word imaginary numbers, right? But it's not too bad. So I'm going to clear this off. We're going to take a look at number 3 and number 4 here, where it's going to be a little different because we're not going to be working with perfect squares anymore. So let me get this cleaned off and we'll get into the next part. Okay, so we're back with questions number 3 and 4. So now we're not necessarily working with perfect squares anymore, so we might have to break up that other number inside of the square root. So we're going to look at number 3 here. Again, the first things first, I'm going to rewrite this as -1 times +5. And again, the square root of -1 is I. Well, the square root of 5, well, I can't simplify that any further. So that's just going to be the square root of 5. So the answer that I have here is I square root of 5. Now, if I'm able to break up 5, then I would break that up even further. But in this case, I was not able to. But that does kind of lead us into number 4 here, where we may be able to simplify our a value. So again, first things first, I'm going to rewrite this as -1 times 80. And again, the square root of -1 is I. Well, 80, I can break that up into something times something. Well, if I try to think what the biggest perfect square that'll go into 80 will be, well, it so happens to be 16. 16 times 5 is going to get me back to 80. So let me try to make that a little easier for y'all to see. So square root of 16 times the square root of, that's kind of hard to see. Might be the best I can get it. So, well, then we can keep simplifying. This is going to stay I. The square root of 16 is 4. And this is going to be square root of 5. So the way I'm going to rewrite this is with the terms here at the front, 4 and I. That's going to be 4 I square root of 5. And this would be the most simplified that this negative square root of -80 is going to get. So we're going to take a look at number 5 and number 6 here in just a minute. And that'll conclude our little section on imaginary numbers. And then you guys are also going to practice those here shortly as well. So let me get this wiped off and we'll take a look at number 5 and number 6. All right, so we're back with questions number 5 and number 6. And again, here, we're going to have to break these down as far as we can. So again, first things first, so I'm going to rewrite this radical here as -1 times 32. And again, the square root of -1 is I. 32 is going to break up into 16 times 2. The biggest perfect square that'll go into 32 is 16. Well, 16 times 2 gets me back to 32. And again, I'm going to simplify. The square root of 16 is 4. I is going to go right next to it with the square root of 2 being left over. So, hopefully that made some sense, which will lead us into our last example here, which is number 6. And again, we're going to factor it, or not factor it, sorry. We're going to simplify it as far down as we can. So the first thing I'm going to do is rewrite this as -1 times the number I have. which is 192. And again, square root of -1 is I. Now 192, it's a bigger number, so you may have to play some trial and error here, dividing in your perfect squares. But in this case, our perfect square, that's going to go into 192. And the biggest one that is going to be 64. Well, 64 times 1 gets us 192. 3. So square root of 64 times square root of 3 is the square root of 192. Well, this is going to simplify. Square root of 64 is 8. I, so 8i, square root of 3. And that is as simplified that this radical will get. So that's going to conclude our notes for today. We're going to come back and we're going to learn how to solve equations with I. But if you have any questions, just reach out to me and we will get you to where you need to be. So I'll see you in the next one.